Some plants would shed off their leaves ahead of a difficult season like a drought or even a cold winter. And some animals would move to new locations ahead of a difficult weather season in their usual habitations. And these are their different ways of adjusting their lives in order to cope with what we have called forces of nature. Well, disaster experts would call that resilience. Now, behind me at the Geneva International Convention Center, close to 4,000 people from all over the world are gathered to discuss just that, the safety of people and investments in the face of increasing disaster events. The Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, organized by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, is a gathering of people and institutions working in different ways to reduce deaths and economic losses from natural and man-made emergencies.
I am enormously comforted and compelled by this year's Global Platform. We have assembled more than 4,000 concerned and committed individuals from governments, from the fields of science, public policy and academia, from civil society and international organizations, from media to concerned citizens to debate, discuss, and take clear actions for reducing disaster risk and building resilience.
The basis of all conversations here is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, a document that sets targets and priorities in reducing disaster risks and defines approaches in achieving those targets. Adopted by member states in 2015 in Sendai, Japan. High in the agenda is the fifth target of the framework, requiring nations to have national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. With just a few months to go, many African nations, including Kenya, do not have national strategies defining what risks they are exposed to, the approaches to address them, and the roles of different agencies and departments in reducing the possibility of disasters happening. The Global Platform is a learning opportunity. As disasters and their drivers are transboundary, countries learn from each other's experience and find ways of collaborating for faster progress. Happening soon after the cyclones Idai and Kenneth hit Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, it was an opportunity for the affected countries in the continent to reflect on what did and didn't work and mobilize support of the international community in building back the cities and the villages that were affected.
A lot of infrastructures were destroyed, the roads, as I said, I think we have seen it on the media, it was terrible. I understand it was the worst cyclone in the southern hemisphere, so we were all caught by surprise. There was previous information telling us that there was going to be that event, but nobody had the idea of the magnitude of the event. So that's why it caused a lot of damages.
Vous avez raison, la plateforme de Genève arrive à point nommé, tout juste quelques semaines après ce qui s'est passé, les inondations avec le cyclone Idai, d'ailleurs suivi de Kenneth. Le Mozambique a été encore touché par Kenneth. L'année dernière, le Mozambique était également touché avec le Malawi, le Zimbabwe. Et Kenneth a touché tout dernièrement les Comores. C'est vous dire qu'il y a lieu d'accélérer la mise en œuvre des différentes stratégies justement pour nous permettre de réduire les risques de catastrophes sur le continent. Les leçons apprises, vous avez raison, on a beaucoup appris. Et la leçon que je retiens, c'est la nécessité de bâtir une résilience de nos communautés. Parce que sans résilience face à ces catastrophes naturelles, c'est quand même difficile pour le continent africain.
The cyclones in the southern hemisphere provide context that, driven by a global climate crisis, such extreme weather events are now a reality that Africa will have to contend with. Countries and organizations discussed progress made over the past 2 years in dealing with new and existing threats. these conversations also revealed gaps that must urgently be addressed if reasonable progress is to be made. According to the Global Assessment Report, a study that looks at the international state of risk, the value of international development aid that went into risk prevention between 2007 and 2017 was just a paltry 4% of the entire development aid globally within the same period. Now, what that means is that international community is much more interested or much more moved to respond to disasters as opposed to investing in risk prevention. And so if a continent like Africa that has been so heavily reliant on international development aid is to make progress in creating preventive mechanisms, then innovative financing solutions have to be developed now.
There's a great emphasis on economic development, of course, raising the standards of living and, bringing, facilities and infrastructure to people. But economic development, if not done right, becomes a long-term liability. And we're seeing that, if it's not done to a certain level of resilience, it ends up being a catastrophe, a disaster. So we have to be careful how we spend our investment money, both publicly and privately, because these things are for the long term. When you build a road or piece of infrastructure, or even a home, you want it to last for the infrastructure for centuries, the home for maybe your children and your grandchildren to live in. So you don't want something that, in 10, 20 years will be destroyed by water or by a fire or some other hazard that will come in place.
The principle of disaster risk reduction that forms the basis of these conversations is that of preparing ahead of disaster events, ensuring that in the event of an emergency, people, businesses and infrastructure are able to continue with their lives on normal functions with little or no interference, as opposed to blind budgetary allocations for emergencies that do not define what emergencies could happen or when they could happen. As has been witnessed in the past, risk financing anticipates risks, plans ahead to make people and investments safe, and creates safety nets in case of the emergency happening. This is what the African Union envisioned in creating the African risk capacity.
We do this by offering a threefold approach, I'd like to call it that, which is by helping countries plan helping countries provide an early warning system so as to detect the likelihood of a disaster happening. We started out with drought because that was the crisis, the disaster that was really affecting the continent the most due to a high economic level arising from agriculture. So drought, we help provide early warning in the event of drought. And then we help countries plan adequately their contingency planning so that they can build on safety net systems if they get a payout. And then the third aspect, which I just preempted, is a payout. So it's a risk transfer approach and better improving their financing systems. So it's early warning, contingency planning, and risk transfer through insurance. That's the offering that we do to governments. It's quite comprehensive because in each of these components, there's capacity building provided to the governments and to the countries.
All this is based on solidarity. It's based on pulling risks together. If you have a problem and you face it alone, you need so much. But if you are many, you are facing the same problem. Each one of you will have to use only a bit of effort to get the same results. So therefore, pulling the risk together, giving a common response is always more effective, taking into consideration that disaster never strikes all the countries at the same time.
Beyond protection of the mega infrastructural investments that African nations have currently embarked on, the African risk capacity makes consideration of private businesses and individuals, including rural economies that feed the continent and provide 30% of her annual wealth. The goal is to have member states embed these into their policies and legislations to ensure that no part of society is left behind as adversities become much more frequent and intense.
60% of the population in Africa live in rural areas. 30% of the GDP in average comes from the rural sector. But more importantly, 80% of the food we eat on the continent is produced locally. So you have this 60% of the people who most of them live below the $2 a day, feed us, and are totally at risk. Nobody give them insurance. Not you, not me. Okay? When disaster strikes, who suffers first? It's them. We suffer later because our food price is going to increase. Okay? In the cities if they are not touched. But they suffer. They suffer first. And this is a big part of our economy, our GDP. We have seen cases in Malawi, we calculated, in 1 year, they lost 4 points of GDP.
As different speakers and participants engaged in different sessions, one point that stood out was the need to accelerate actions as the world already lives in a climate crisis. The conference ends in Geneva, but African leaders and institutions only begin a new resolve to help the continent adjust accordingly to emerging challenges and emergencies, to strengthen internal collaborations, and to ensure the money follows the commitments. For the Africa Development Journal, I am David Owino.